Juan Francisco Manzano and Frederick Douglass's respective autobiographies, published nearly a century apart, reveal much about the state of slavery in both the United States and Cuba prior to abolition. In order to analyze these two accounts of slavery, it is imperative that we begin with the history of slavery in order to provide context. The 5 sub-questions that we will be addressing include: who was Juan Francisco Manzano? Who was Frederick Douglass? How does Manzano describe Cuban slavery in the 19th century? How does Douglass depict slavery in the United States in the 19th century? And in what way does the respective literature reveal similarities and differences in Cuba and American slavery?
Before addressing the multiple questions that will aid us in answering the larger thesis topic, it is imperative that the slave trade and its implications be addressed in the interest of providing historical context. In the colonized slavery system, slaves formed a large part of a human inventory. During the period of slavery, it is estimated that 10 times as many Africans came to Spanish America than to the United States. Within Spanish America, Cuba absorbed more than half of the slaves entering the region, most of which were taken from West Africa. It is estimated that in the midst of transatlantic transportation, also known as the Middle Passage, around 36 million African slaves died during the voyage or suffered other casualties. The process of colonization not only displaced millions of Africans, but also part of a massive attempt at racial purification. The colonization process was further legitimized by such laws such as the Asiento, which was the license to traffic slaves who fit within a specific age range aimed at collecting slaves who were in top physical conditions and could therefore work long, strenuous hours. 2 individuals that were affected by the slave trade were Juan Francisco Manzano and Frederick Douglass. Both men who were born into slavery but whose experiences varied, wrote autobiographies to tell their life stories and portray the real horrors associated with slavery in the Americas at large.
Manzano's autobiography is titled The Autobiography of a Slave. This piece occupies a special place in Cuban history because it offers a view into a literary history that we would not have been able to see. It is the only existing autobiography of a slave written during this time. The overall goal of his writing is to recount his tormented existence of an urban slave. Manzano was born in 1797 and died in 1854. He worked as an urban slave. During his time captive, he taught himself how to read and write. He has been the only slave in Spanish American history to achieve success as a writer. The time period of which he wrote his journal was one in which the Caribbean wealth solely relied on the sugar industry. Manzano contributed to the wealth of the nation by working as a slave. After working for an extensive period of time, he liberated himself with money that was raised by a band of his admirers.
Frederick Douglass was born in 1818 and died in 1895. He was born into slavery and, despite opposition, taught himself to read and write, eventually realizing the importance of the abolition movement and his opposition to enslavement. He spent years redefining his views on human rights and spent even more time teaching other slaves. Douglass attempted to escape slavery many times and finally was able to with the help of a free black woman. During his life as an escaped slave, Douglass published several works, including his autobiography, thus putting his life at risk. His many supporters spent their time trying to buy his legal papers, eventually becoming a free man.
Frederick Douglass, born a slave, that somehow has the audacity and drive to run away from slavery and decides to become a leader against slavery. So not only does he have the mental capacity to see himself free, he has the audacity to say, I can speak for the slaves better than the abolitionists that speak on our behalf and don't understand our pain.
In Manzano's autobiography, titled The Autobiography of a Slave, Manzano describes slavery in 19th century Cuba as fractured. Manzano, describing his family's situation and his mistress, says, I said my farewells to all of the family, and we all cried, for we had lived in the most perfect harmony. As she, my mistress, persevered in not laying a hand on me, or in ordering others to do so, I had forgotten all the past and loved her like my mother. Here it is obvious that Manzano does not hate his mistress because of the elevated way in which he was treated in relation to the other slaves, whose blackness kept them from receiving favorable treatment. Manzano also says, So as not to interfere with my productivity, I was prohibited from writing. By revealing that he was prohibited from practicing writing and other educational activities, Manzano reveals that education among slaves was considered to be dangerous. In this way, he was not separated from the other slaves, who were also prohibited from accessing basic educational knowledge. Manzano's narrative overall begins with his childhood and the relative bliss of this time in his life, due to the ignorance and his elevated social status as a mulatto as opposed to being a full black. The narrative follows his time as a child to his multiple changes in setting, his time under an abusive mistress who, despite her slaveholding status, is revered by Manzano as a mother figure.
Douglass was already free when he wrote his narrative and had a large following due to his public persona. Douglass was known to both prominent abolitionists and Confederate leaders alike. This was very different from Manzano, who ran away, but it is unknown if he achieved freedom and died before his works were published. Themes in Douglass's work are the deep physical and mental scars caused by slavery and the difficulty in overcoming these strains. Quotes from Douglass's autobiography, titled The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, include, "It is better that a dozen slaves suffer under the lash than that the overseer should be convicted, in the presence of slaves, of having been at fault. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold a man transformed into a brute." Douglass's writing reveals that his slavery experience was absolutely brutal, and that there is no system of justice in place, which permanently kept the slaves under the mercy of the overseers, regardless of any wrongdoings on the overseers' part.
In both scenarios, Manzano and Douglass were discouraged from obtaining any form of basic education, which suggests that in both Cuba and the United States, education was considered dangerous in the hands of slaves. In Manzano's case, he was an urban slave and was thus confined to the domestic sphere as a house servant to his mistress. Because of his elevated racial status as a mulatto opposed to a full black, he was permitted to learn trades and was further separated from the rest of the slaves, who were not supposed to mingle with Manzano or other mulattoes. Cuban slavery is depicted as highly fractured in regards to racial rankings. However, Douglass's account, which reveals his time as a plantation-based slave, does not highlight as much fracturing within the United States slavery system. What is more, Douglass was able to escape slavery and went on to become a prominent public figure who defied the Eurocentric belief that blacks were inherently intellectually less than whites. Douglass's achievements, including the publication of his autobiography during his lifetime, reveal that the issue of slavery was more visible in the United States than it was in Cuba, considering that Manzano's account was not published until the mid-20th century, many years after his death.
Manzano and Douglass each left lasting impressions on the people of their time and for years to follow. Manzano's works are celebrated because they are the only existing first-hand accounts of 19th century Cuban slavery. Douglass, instead, left an impression not only through his writings, but by his plans and the way he lived his life. He took a more active approach in the community and spoke out, gaining interest and support more easily.